Later, Mark.
Sarah, we need to get out of here.
Director Conor McCon brings us From the Dark, a 2014 Irish vampire movie. The movie stars Niamh Algar and is a very simple story. It focuses on a couple who get lost in the back roads of Ireland somewhere, and they end up at this kind of very rural area where there's only one kind of farmhouse to be seen for miles around. However, the farmer of this farmhouse has recently discovered there has been what appears to be a vampire under the ground, sleeping in the earth, appearing to have been staked through the heart and kind of lying dormant in this kind of peat bog for God knows how, who knows how long. But he ends up accidentally awakening him, and this vampire is now on the hunt, and that includes our two intrepid explorers who have ended up at this kind of farmhouse. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So this is kind of a one location kind of style movie, really all taking place on this kind of farmyard. Obviously there's multiple parts of this kind of farm, but nonetheless it's all really a one location with a very small cast. And to be honest with you, not a lot of dialogue. The vampire itself is kind of a Nosferatu kind of vampire. It looks a little bit like the creatures from The Descent. Let's talk about what I think works in this movie. I think despite this movie not having a huge amount of dialogue, we get the bulk of the dialogue actually in kind of the first act where we're introduced to our characters. I did find our characters quite likeable. This couple seemed like very kind of real, down-to-earth people with kind of a, you know, good kind of banter between them, a little bit of kind of like throwing shade at each other playfully, things like that. So I bought into this couple like they felt like they had some good chemistry and were a kind of a real couple. I kind of quite like the fact that this movie gives us enough information so we can piece together what's happened, but it doesn't kind of like feel the need to give you the backstory of the vampire. We can just know that there's a vampire under the earth which has kind of got a stake through its heart. We can kind of piece together the rest, and it kind of gives it this air of unknown, and you're thinking back to decades or even hundreds of years past. How long has this kind of vampire been under there, and what led him to that, and what was the kind of the world like at that kind of time? So it kind of gives you all these kind of like, oh, I wonder what that was like, and things like this. So that was all very good. Now this is a small thing, but I'm going to say it because I've seen so much of this in other movies. But this movie obviously takes place at night, being a vampire kind of movie, and thank God they've actually gone for night shoots rather than shooting day for night scenes, which is fast becoming a personal peeve of mine. Yes, the screen's a little dark at times, it's hard to see what's going on sometimes, but to be honest with you, it's a sacrifice I'm willing to pay rather than kind of like day for night shoots. The vampire effect, I've got to say they kind of tease him a little bit first of all, kind of showing you kind of the outline and stuff. He looks a little bit like the kind of the creatures from The Descent, or a kind of a Nosferatu kind of style vampire. I think he looks quite cool. I was a little bit questioning his kind of level of intelligence, to be honest with you. You weren't quite sure how sort of sentient he was. Certainly when he turns people, they seem more like kind of feral beasts and stuff. So I was kind of like, I wasn't quite sure, the intelligence level of this particular kind of master vampire, so to speak. We'll come on to that again in a little bit, but he kind of looks quite cool and quite kind of grizzled and stuff, and the way that he's kind of shot against this kind of misty kind of farm with kind of like the almost gliding across this kind of peat bog area, I thought was kind of pretty effective. And we even get kind of like vampire vision at some kind of points, showing you how the light kind of affects them and things like that, which I thought was quite fun. The movie's very simple. It's very kind of, you can just put it on and kind of, this is the film you don't necessarily have to kind of like mega concentrate on because the plot is very slight. But it's kind of just essentially a chase movie, really. This couple trying to kind of get away from vampire or vampires at some point. And I thought it was relatively kind of well shot. As I say, A little bit dark maybe for some, but you know, I get that obviously it's trying to kind of be one that's entirely shot at night. But the location looks great. It's kind of out of the way, rural area. There's no kind of signs of help and things like this. So yeah, and there's some fairly kind of good kind of set pieces and kind of like, you know, low tech action sequences and things like that with this kind of vampire attacking. So overall, I thought it was a relatively kind of entertaining movie. What doesn't work for me, I think the part of this problem in this film is that it is very simple. The plot is really a couple of people being chased by a vampire. That's it. There's not really much else to it than that. I was kind of expecting like other characters to turn up or something else to happen and things like this, but it isn't. It's just a kind of a knight running away from a vampire. But also the fact that there's very little dialogue in this. For reasons I won't go into, our couple don't communicate a huge amount throughout the actual kind of like where it starts to get a little hairy. So there's very little kind of dialogue, and it's just kind of people running around in the dark. Now, I think it's kind of fine to a degree, but it makes it a little bit, even though it's kind of like, you know, they're exciting sequences and stuff, it's not super gripping, to be honest, because you're kind of just watching people running around in the dark in a farm, and you know it's sort of, once you've seen it for a couple of sequences, there's not much else that's going on with that, which I thought was a little bit kind of disappointing. I think it needed to have a little bit more going on. I also think the problem's compounded by some sort of like logic issues. I mean, the film is so simple, it's hard to believe you can think, and hang on, there's plot holes and logic issues here. For example, that without kind of spoiling anything, we learn that these particular vampires in this film are very, very sensitive to light, even artificial light, even from like a phone, for example. But I'm thinking, well, if they're kind of being repelled by a phone, we can clearly see there's a full moon outside. I mean, how much is like too much, and how much light can they kind of stand? Because I can see that there's a kind of full moon outside. You know, it's relatively light. We can kind of see, you know, things like the sunrise starting to come up, and it's like, you know, it seems the light rule's a little bit kind of like, you know, it needs to be what it needs to be in certain sequences and not in others, to be honest with you. As I've mentioned, I think the vampire is, although I don't think you necessarily need to kind of go into his backstory, I was kind of like, is this kind of vampire like feral, or is it kind of able to kind of like think and stuff like that? I didn't really get the sense like the vampire, you got to kind of really understand it all that much. I get it's, you know, you don't want to have a vampire necessarily with a personality like this, but it's kind of like, I didn't even know if it was really just like acting on just like feral impulses and very minimal intelligence, or if it was able to kind of like rationalise and things like this. It didn't really even get you that much. The vampire is very much like not the point of view here. So, you know, you kind of like have some questions, and even kind of like the circumstances that lead up to the vampire. I mean, we see that light affects vampires so much that like a headlights of a vehicle basically turns these vampires into stone or dust, and they kind of just crumble. So I'm thinking, well, you know, when this original vampire, the master vampire, if you like, you know, why wasn't this vampire left out in the daylight to kind of crumble and things like this? I mean, I guess you could argue if it was been there for thousands of years, they might not have been able to rationalise that, but it just seems to me that it's got a stake through its heart, so whoever has done this originally has put a stake through its heart and then buried it, where it would have been, surely it would have been more effective just to kind of have it in the light. And then we have decisions by our protagonist to kind of like run out of clearly well-lit areas to go and do other things and try and, you know, oh, I've got a new plan, let's try this sort of thing. And thinking, well, if you know, I guess we wouldn't have a movie if that was the case, but it just seems to me that the movie's trying to do things or not try to do things. Like, for example, again, they use, eventually they do use fire as a weapon, but that's not until the second half of the movie. And then we have a sequence where they're struggling to find light, but at one point there's even like the stove is catching fire, but they don't try and like use fire to A, light something, B, as a weapon, or even like, you know, burn the house or something. And none of them look for like a weapon to defend themselves. There just seems to be a little bit of kind of like silly logic or no logic or plot holes when this film is very, very simplistic. So overall, I think this is a kind of fun movie. I think it's an enjoyable kind of like vampire on the loose, and it's well made and enjoyable, but it's very much kind of, it doesn't really think outside the box in any particular kind of meaningful way. The acting's fine, but there's little dialogue, so you kind of feel like you kind of don't super connect to the characters after a while. It's watchable, but it's unremarkable. I'll give it a 5 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.